done, man. I spent ages trying to copy and paste that. Right.
But it was quicker than me trying to load up Safari and get into WhatsApp, because don't ever buy a fucking iMac. They are, swear to God, pieces of junk.
Have you just got a new one?
No, I got this one in May last year, right? So like lockdown's happening, all my work's going to be at home, like we're doing the podcast on Zoom. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to make this investment, right? It's on a credit plan, of course, right? But it's honestly, David, it's a fucking piece of crap. Like, I had to take it into the Apple store and like, I mean, obviously I don't know anything about computers as part of the embarrassment as well. So when the guy's like, oh, so like he's talking to me about like processing and what it is I'm doing, I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah,
So, like, I really don't. So like, obviously, like he was loving the fact that I know jack shit about computers. And so they had to wipe my entire system and reinstall it. So I lost like loads of stuff. Like I lost some photos and some documents and a couple of drafts of things that I've been writing. But I was like, it's worth it in the long run because it's kind of unusable. Like, I mean, we're talking 10 minutes to get onto a Zoom call, maybe 10 minutes to load up a document, which is, I know that doesn't sound like a lot of time, but when you pay like top dollar for like a good machine, you expect it to be fast. In fact, it's so slow that I returned to my old laptop that I bought in 2008.
yeah.
And it's much faster. It's just more reliable. And I'm like, and I'm not the only person that has this problem. Don't buy this stuff. It's fucking junk. Cheers.
Good to know.
It makes me pissed off.
Yeah, no. I mean, everything to do with technology pisses me off. Ruth got a new car recently, and she was saying like, it is though good though when you're a woman and you can go in and sort of go, oh, I don't know what's wrong with my car. Do you know what I mean? Rather than for me, it would just be a walk of shame. Do you know what I mean? Like my brother was saying that as well. Like, you know, it's a different dynamic. You have to admit that you're one of those men who doesn't know if anything works. You know what I mean? And men divide very evenly into those two categories: real men and men who don't understand how anything works.
Well, real men make hard times.
Oh,
like this new logic puzzle.
Yeah.
Hard men make soft times, good times. No, hard men make good times. Good times make soft men. Soft men make hard times. Hard times make hard men.
Yeah.
Oh, he's some lad.
Okay, what are we talking about in this podcast?
Well, we've got to talk about Afghanistan.
We've got to talk about Afghanistan. We mentioned the Sharon Graham stuff.
Aye, sure, because we were right.
Yeah.
Well, particularly, I would like to say I was right.
Yeah. And I suppose we should return to the Scottish Government Green stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Right, I'm just going to get a splash of water.
Hard men make good times make soft men make bad times make hard men.
That is the new intro music. Right.
Don't you think it sounds like Frankie Goes to Hollywood?
Yeah, yeah.
Like the whole thing is like so fucking homoerotic. I think it would be an amazing like electro tune.
Yeah. Can we talk about this at the start?
Let's just talk about it because you're already recording, and then I can just like stitch it in.
Okay. So what is it? Strong men make good times, right? Good times make soft men. Soft men make bad
times.
Bad times, and then the bad times go on to make hard men again, right? So this cyclical idea.
Yeah, this is how human history has progressed.
So yeah, no, but that is a conservative theory of what happens, the cycles of degeneracy. Do you know what I mean? Strength leads to decadence, decadence to weakness. Weakness requires, a heroic figure to re-emerge, who in our case is, what's his name again? The guy who tweeted that.
Lawrence Fox.
Lawrence Fox. So for our time, the heroic figure, the sort of Bismarckian Superman, is Lawrence Fox.
Wasn't he like, I mean, isn't his main sort of public job being like the sidekick in Lewis or something?
Oh, like his acting career?
Aye. Is that not what he did? I mean, apart from being married to Billie Piper, who I will not hear a word against.
I didn't know he was married to Billie Piper.
Aye. All these guys are punching.
Oh, punching, yeah. I was about to say that, punching. So yeah, but I mean, look, no one remembers today that Hitler was once a bohemian painter.
Hitler is a soft man. Lawrence Fox is a soft man.
Oh, controversial. But do you know
how is that controversial?
Of course.
I don't think that there's anything like, I see Lawrence Fox as a very soft, fragile man. And I think it's so obvious to me, and he doesn't see himself like that. And I always think there's a kind of a brittleness in it. The way that someone like Trump sort of embraced his campness and his femininity. Like, you think of his little dancing and, his like kind of audacious taste and his whole aesthetic. Really
mean girl thing.
Whereas someone like Lawrence Fox, I just think, baby, you've never been in a fight in your life. And you're trying to do this sort of big kind of, he wants to be a strong man, but he just looks so weak.
I've just realised I'm not using my microphone.
I mean, you sound good. Oh.
Sorry.
What did you buy? What's in your cardboard box? What's in the box?
I watched that again recently.
I love Seven. I watched that again recently as well. Probably means there's something wrong with you if you watch that film more than once.
Oh, it's just so 90s though. That's why I love it. I love like a 90s genre film. How do I sound, by the way?
Sound great.
Let's just
have this in the podcast, you know what I mean?
Oh, you're away. Can I hear you now?
Hear me now? I was just saying, let's just have all this in the podcast. I mean, people know how amateur we are now anyway. It doesn't make any difference. No, but it's such a great kind of like 90s genre film. Seven, obviously better than that is Silence of the Lambs. Another one I re-watched recently. Not quite in the same league again, but LA Confidential. I mean,
fantastic. I mean, I have a real weak spot for all neo-noir. Like, aesthetically, it really speaks to my taste, like more than a kind of like original like film noir. But like all of that like sleaze and neon, and like the increasingly dark themes of something like Blue Velvet, for example. The one I watched recently, just last week, was Dressed to Kill. I don't know if you've seen that.
No.
Really like quite notorious Brian De Palma movie from the 80s with Michael Caine in it. Big recommends. Like, you can see where a lot of the like the look and the narrative from Silence of the Lambs came from.
Right, yeah.
Much inspired by the Brian De Palma Dressed to Kill.
Yeah, anyway, I think there was a spree of those kind of great kind of noir films. I'd kill for a film like that as well. Again, the ensemble cast thing. I don't really feel like, I don't really feel like we live in an age of a good ensemble cast. Maybe, again, I'm just old, right? I don't really like a lot of the actors that are around right now. I don't feel like there's a lot of gravity. And also the cinema is just swamped with this Marvel shit. When's that going to end? That's been going on for like
Never.
20 years.
Like it will never end. It's here to stay, so you better get used to it. I actually went to the cinema last week or the week before to see The Night House, which is a new sort of psychological thriller, horror, bit supernatural, but ultimately very enjoyable. Like, what I liked is the female lead, as with a lot of these things that I find compelling, is completely fucking dislikable. Like, I really enjoy when I'm watching a film where there's like a female lead. She's like, she refuses to be a victim. She's just a bit of a bitch. Do you know what I mean? Which like is a good complex character.
But I hate what they do now with these Marvel films, where they have one that's really like quirky and self-conscious, and another one that tries to be a bit more like dark and adult. It's like, these are comic books. They're for children. If you want to have a film that deals with, you know, like dark material, then I don't know, draw it from a novel or you know what I mean, a play or something. Like get away from this comic book stuff. It's driving me nuts.
I bet that's really controversial. And I would invite people to feedback on that idea. I mean, I tend to agree. Like, I think like all of the Marvel stuff is a sign of how good times make soft men.
Yeah. No, but this is basically because Scorsese said this. He was like, these films are shit, right? And people like did that. It's always this debate about who are you to say, you know, what's shit and what isn't. You know, who are you to say that just because something's like pop culture, that means it's rubbish, that it was initially for children or teenagers, that it's necessarily bad, you know. And there's this extreme kind of ecumenicism in art where it's like everything's good, everything's equally good, it's just a matter of taste. And Scorsese's like, no, it's not, it's shit, right? The fact that it was initially for children shows in the final product. And I have to say I've got a certain sympathy for it.
Yeah, but I do think that this is like a strange thing of like the crisis of like patriarchy, essentially, right? So when I see like Father's Day gifts, right, I always have a bit of a nightmare getting stuff from my dad, right? Firstly, his football team is Albion Rovers. Merch not easy to come by, right? Yeah. He doesn't play golf and he doesn't drink. He's not into cars. So like a lot of the classic Father's Day bits, like just don't really suit. But what I've noticed over the years is that increasingly a lot of like Father's Day tat is all comic book related. It's Batman, and it's Marvel, it's like superhero, it's Hulk. And I'm like, oh my God, because these are boys I was at school with who are now fathers.
Yeah.
This is part of the crisis of patriarchy, which is forcing them to be infantilized. Like the way that women have been infantilized, like as part of this whole feminization of the traditional family unit.
I always think about a time when I was outraged when I saw a father and son dressed identically. So they were dressed in the same clothes, and they were both dressed like Bart Simpson, and they both had caps on, shorts and a t-shirt and a skateboard. And I just sort of said instinctually, without thinking about it, where's the ladder here? How does the son look at the father and say, one day I'll change? There's a course in my life. One day, right now I'm a child. I'm given a certain license to be a child, a certain degree of irresponsibility. And then there'll come a moment in my life where I have a certain degree of responsibility, and I have a certain degree of, and I have to represent something both to my family and my wider community. That ladder doesn't exist. The boy is the man is the boy. There's no separation of responsibilities.
I mean, it really shouldn't be surprising when like the material conditions that people are growing up in now means that there's pretty much zero social mobility. Do you know what I mean? Like your chances of living at home with your parents into your mid-30s are really quite high, and that's a very new thing for people in the UK.
And beyond that, man, like, because sometimes people mock folk who stay at home with their parents, but it's like, you should look at the statistics. 40% of new buyers, their parents are buying the house. So okay, you don't live at home anymore, but materially your life only makes sense because of your parents' proper, housing property, basically, right? So yeah, I mean that's just a huge thing, something we talk about a lot.
Since we're talking about cinema and objective taste, why don't we have a little interesting segue into our main topic for today, by mentioning conceptual art classes?
Oh God, oh my God, that is a good segue.
It is a good segue.
Me and Kat watched a video where James, I have to grant him this. He referred to the situation in Afghanistan as apocalypse NGO, which I think is great, right?
I mean, it's going to be the title of this episode.
Yeah. I always go, yeah, apocalypse NGO. So, and it's a video. You can find it on YouTube. I think it was on a BBC program.
Yeah, it's from Bitter Lake.
Was it from Bitter Lake?
Yeah.
Right, okay, yeah, I remember that now. And she's there's a woman instructing young Afghan people on modern art, and she's showing them that famous urinal. Who's it by again?
Marcel Duchamp.
Right, and
the look of disgust on your face.
No, see when I was showing that clip again, my first instinct was, don't tell them how we live. I just realized that, oh my God, they're going to find out how we live, right? They're going to find out how we in the West, like what our culture's become, right? And anyway, she shows a picture of this toilet, right, to everyone in the room, and they zoom in on one young woman's face, and she is disgusted.
I mean, like, honestly, you can just see her being like, this is fucking, like...
This is outrageous. She was shaking her head. She was outrageous, right? So, no, but that is a good title for the podcast, because that ultimately was the message of Apocalypse Now, was that the Vietnamese and the Cambodians were prepared for war to the knife, and the Americans were listening to rock and roll and getting drunk and surfing, right? And you had a clash of civilizations, where you had a frivolous civilization coming up against the civilization that was still trained for survival and for victory. Anyway, there was an article in Spectator with a stupid title, something like, did gender politics lose us the war in Afghanistan? Now, the answer is obviously no. Generally speaking, by the way, whenever there's a headline with a question in it, the answer is no, right? Because it's a provocative title. But it also did reveal that something like $800 million had been spent in Afghanistan on gender programs, and I couldn't find what this meant, but it sounded like it meant a series of different programs, typically around universities and NGOs. And it just highlights again, like, more than anything, the corruption that must have been going on. There must be all these kind of, like, Robin DiAngelo types who've bought fucking mansions out of this. There must be.
Like, this is a serious part of the whole military industrial complex, is that these types of occupations are fucking cash cows for NGOs. They're cash cows for NGOs. Like, people make so much money out of that. I mean, I want to know, like, where that conceptual art class came from. I mean, also some of the comments are quite amusing, which is like the first one after like 2 years of like nobody looking at it is just this aged well.
Oh my God. So yeah, but again though, it shows you that, like, whenever historically the West has engaged in military occupation or colonialism or whatever, it's always done this. It's always used its own domestic ideologies and tried to make them plant root in the foreign soil. Now, traditionally, that was Christianity, or ideas about the empire and the royal family and so on. It's just funny that now it's this. It's just funny now it's modern art and...
Well, that specifically was like for Afghan women. It was like a post-Taliban class for Afghan women on conceptual art. And it could be something from Brassai.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why like all satire is dead or like finished. That's why that like reboot of Spit and Image is probably the worst thing ever to have been shown on television. Is because the age of that is dead. Because this stuff is really happening. There was also the WikiLeaks page that, I mean, I'd shared it on social media. It was just talking about, it was quite clear, like evidence facts of how the CIA deployed feminism and women's rights in Afghanistan as like basically a marketing strategy to make the war and occupation seem palatable to people. Like this is the number one thing, is that feminism, and I use that in scare quotes, women's rights and equality is used to justify war and invasion and occupation. I mean, this shouldn't surprise anyone. And
No,
people,
no.
like, I fear have switched off their critical faculties. Even people who were very critical of someone like Hillary Clinton, who, do you know what I mean, only 5 years ago, used that exact type of politics in her election campaign to justify the attitudes that she has. I mean, she's a neo war hawk. I mean, she's a war hawk, right? So people, I think, have maybe just been very troubled by some of the pictures coming out of Afghanistan, which, yeah, they are shocking. But everything that's happening is a product of the occupation of Afghanistan for 20 years. Everything that is happening, like the Taliban's like resurgence. I mean, the Taliban didn't come from outside. Like, it's not like the American troops left and then the Taliban came in on like a bus and like suddenly appeared. These are the poor fucking Afghan shepherds who've had like not money for like, you know, actual social needs, but money for fucking conceptual art classes shoved down their throats, or talking about their problematic gender norms or whatever the fuck that kind of money was used for, that's mentioned in the Spectator article. That's who the Taliban are. Like, they are people in Afghanistan, and that's not legitimizing them. I'm not apologizing for the Taliban, but that is what that is. And I mean, a city like Kabul, there's no fight. There was like, I mean, there was like no resistance.
See, this is important because it's what's different this time. You have a lot of people talking about the Soviet experience, but the kind of left nationalist Soviet-aligned government in Kabul survived something like 2.5 to 3 years after the Soviet forces had left. What's remarkable here is just that that regime had no legitimacy, like absolutely none. It was total, it was paper. There was nothing behind it. And there wasn't much behind the kind of the Tsar Revolution type governments, right? But what there was an ethos. First of all, those governments emerged from actual domestic revolutions, mostly by like the middle class in the cities who were Soviet aligned. But they also did reach out to women. They also did reach out to ethnic minorities. They tried to institute land reform in the countryside, backfired disastrously. That's why like the warlords fought back initially. But there was a real project there that had a very thin material base, but was still representing something in Afghan society. This occupation and the regime it set up was totally alien. Like it didn't really have a domestic base of really any amount. I mean, literally, the Taliban was on the US Army's bumper as it was leaving Kabul. It's that simple. I mean, they're still there. They're still trying to get out. And the only reason, by the way, that US troops and civilian personnel aren't being massacred is because the Taliban don't want to do it. That's the reality, because they need good international relations. They want to keep aid money coming. They don't want to be blocked from world trade. That's the only reason at this point. So, I mean, it is the most like astonishing defeat. But I mean, I know you've got a boast coming later on. I need to say I've been predicting this for about a year, right? And you can go back and read my articles about it where I just say this is just going to collapse. As soon as the Americans leave, it's going to go. And I didn't know that because, do you know, I mean, I've been on the ground in Afghanistan and all that kind of stuff, right? Apart from anything else, it's just based in like some degree of historical knowledge. Even I was shocked by the way that it collapsed in days. I thought like they'll fight on for a couple of months, maybe, right? But this version of like bombing liberalism into existence, the whole idea is completely ludicrous. And I can't think of, you know, this is the other thing, like Saigon held on for 3 years, right? Or 2 years. So, I mean, what I'm fascinated by is the fact that this form of Western imperialism seems to be extremely institutionally weak. It seems to be extremely bad at generating support in foreign countries. And we've reached this kind of point where, I mean, look, it's not just rhetoric. I think sometimes people go too far and they say, oh, they were just lying when they said, we're going to send girls to school by blowing them up, right? These were just lies. Well, in a certain sense, saying it is noble to die for one's king, right, which was like World War II ideology, that's just a lie on a certain level. But ideology is never just a lie. It's felt, it's believed, right? And you can see that it's believed. Look at Scottish civil society, like, and the people whose pure only response to this situation is, this is just a humanitarian catastrophe. Don't talk about politics. Listen to Afghan voices. Whose exactly? The Taliban?
Center Taliban voices.
Center Taliban? No, seriously, but no, but I mean, they might as well be saying center Taliban voices.
Of course, this is what I mean about this perception of the Taliban being like a force, like an external force. The Taliban are the surviving family members of poor Afghans in rural communities who, you know, their towns were fucking massacred.
Yeah.
Because of the American war effort at home to garner support, the US government then wanted to become a bloodbath. So in order to protect American troops' lives, they resorted to bombing campaigns. Like that, it was drone warfare. It was conducted in the skies, and the people who were victims were rural villages. Do you know what I mean? Like actual, just poor fucking shepherds, right? So if that's not going to radicalize entire families into the Taliban, then I mean, I just don't understand why. I think it is shocking that it happened so quickly, but I don't understand why anyone is surprised that this has happened. And I just would plead with people to, you know, don't get swept up in this is just a humanitarian crisis, because that means you can only have a humanitarian response. And the response needs to be political. It needs to be said, this can never happen again. And like NATO forces, like any of the NATO countries, must not stay in Afghanistan a second longer. Like
yeah, absolutely.
Longer. And the fact that Nicola Sturgeon, I mean, honestly, that's a politician who can never again talk about their anti-war or CND credentials.
Yeah, I agree.
After that statement.
So Nicola Sturgeon was in the front bench of the SNP. Obviously, they were the opposition in 2001, but she supported the invasion of Afghanistan. And in fact, it was John Swinney who introduced the debate to get Holyrood to back the invasion of Afghanistan. Now, part of the reason for this was that there was, you know, some kind of UN mandate to invade Afghanistan. I have to say, that's always annoyed me, that stuff. Like, you know, you got this whole thing about like, I'll oppose the Iraq war if we can't get a UN mandate for it. Fuck the UN. I mean, what is that? Nonsense, honestly. Anyway, so the SNP backed it because they want to be seen to be friends with anti-terrorism, the UN, Washington, London. This is part of their broader strategy. And I sent a media request asking if they now regretted their decision to support the war on occupation. Obviously, I didn't get a response. But then a few days later, Nicola Sturgeon comes out and says, keep NATO troops in Afghanistan. So I think we know they've not changed their mind. And honestly, like anyone who's just saying, oh, it's just for the refugees or whatever, the most poisonous thing you can do is attach the cause of rights for refugees to imperialism. Just please stop attaching all these things to imperialism. Feminism, we have to advance women's rights with imperialism. We have to advance the rights of refugees with imperialism. Stop it. I can't believe we're still doing it 20 years later. It's the most destructive thing you can possibly do.
And like the thing that really gets me about the original arguments to do with the invasion of Afghanistan is that, because it sounds like a really bitter thing to say, but the anti-war movement was fucking right. We were right about this. Like, do you know what I mean? People predicted that this was not the right course of action because it was driven by the whole ideology around the war on terror. So there was never, not that this would have justified it, but there was never a genuine intent to bring any type of peace to Afghanistan. There was never any attempt of peace and reconciliation talks. So after the initial invasion and most of the Taliban fighters fled, there was no amnesty, there was no process by which Taliban fighters could fucking surrender. There was none of that happened. Like, and if you maybe genuinely believed that you were the world's peacemaker nation, like, then maybe that's something you would have considered, but it was never really about that. It was about regime change in the interests of the US.
Absolutely.
And like NATO positioning, nothing to do with the war on terror. It had to be branded as that in order to gain some degree of public support for it at home.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, these arguments are almost cliches by this point, but they bear being restated. That kind of that version of sort of jihadi sort of ethos, is it smaller now or bigger than 2001? Immeasurably bigger. Like, it's spread all over the world, as again the anti-war movement predicted. And I think they actually used those words. I remember Old Galloway, I remember him saying over and over again, this will metastasize and spread all over the world if you attack countries like Afghanistan and Iraq. It will go everywhere, and it has. It's all over Africa now. It's in China, so through huge swathes of Asia, right? So we know that attacking it militarily makes it bigger, right? Even if it was attacked, do you know what I mean? Like, as you say, no sooner was the United States in Afghanistan than they were down to their usual business, cutting deals with local mujahideen types. You know, it was setting up gas pipeline deals. It was putting pressure on Iran's western border. It was doing all the kinds of stuff that imperialism does. It was not, de-radicalizing the people of Afghanistan or some nonsense like that, right? So yeah, it's a load of old guff, but you see it coming bubbling back up to the surface again because people are stampeded into these humanitarian choices. That's the whole method of like, oh well, politics is well and good, but right now there's a crisis, and look at these people at Kabul airport, and right now we just need to talk about how we save them. Oh, and by the way, the most responsible way to do that is with NATO. And it's incredible watching it in Scotland as well, because liberal humanitarianism is so hegemonic in this country, perhaps more than any other. You know what I mean? Because even in countries that we think of as quite deep into that ethos, like in the, like the Nordic countries or something, there's more pragmatism. Even there, right, where it's also a problem. There's lots of stuff with NATO in Nordic countries, but there's still a bit more pragmatism in how foreign policy is viewed. In Scotland, it's rabid. I mean, I didn't see the Greens are formally anti-NATO. I haven't seen them mention it. I've looked at all their official communications and it's not been mentioned, right? It's a joke. This is, by the way, NATO's worst defeat ever. Like, in its entire history, this is its most calamitous moment. And it's also one that's exposed a lot of infighting inside NATO. There's a huge amount of disunity. And what has become apparent, as again, everyone on the anti-war left knew, is that NATO is just a front for the United States. And as soon as Biden says, I'm going, it's over. It's over. And you've this pathetic appearance of Nicola Sturgeon saying, no, let's stay. You and whose army? Do you know what I mean? And I'm so sick of this stuff, man. Like, people say it's a cheap shot, but pick up a gun and go and do it yourself. Stop sending like poor kids from some of the poorest communities in Scotland, because that's who's getting sent over, right? Pick up a gun yourself and go and do it the next time you have one of these bright ideas. But the important thing is that everyone understands that Nicola Sturgeon really, really cares about the refugees. That's what's important here, right? Not the fact that she's going to be putting these young men and women back in harm's way again. That's irrelevant, right? The most important thing is everyone knows that Nicola Sturgeon is a lovely, cuddly liberal, right? It's grotesque. I find this stuff uglier than what you see the Tories doing or what you see Biden doing. Because with Biden it's callous, right? But we knew that he's fucking Genghis Khan. That's who the head of the United States is, right? He's a warlord. At the end of the day, he's like that. Not in my country's interest. I'm out of here, right? At least there's a degree of honesty at last, right? With Sturgeon and Blair and all these types, it's still this. Oh, we need to stay. We need to stay and help the refugee, help the poor Afghan people. We need to throw another 100 million at some gender program in Afghanistan. What the fuck are you talking about? And it's just also, it's not going to happen. So it's pure PR at this point. Everyone knows it's not going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, NATO is a fucking relic. It is a Cold War relic, and it is run by the US for the US. Like the whole UK-US relationship, like solidified within NATO, is like, it is part of the America's project in Europe. Like that's what this is.
Yeah.
So why is the First Minister of Scotland so supportive of NATO? Like this is not the type of independence that I would want to see. Like I am categorically not interested in independent Scotland being a member of NATO. Like it's the thing that frustrates me about a lot of this is how much goddamn ground the left has lost on these questions, which I think are of fundamental importance. Things like imperialism, things like NATO, things like Palestine. The amount of ground that is being lost because people are being herded into this like humanitarian position. Like, I mean, it's fucking, I mean.
So I mean, what I think that the line that's drawn under this now is I don't see a return to the last few years of Western foreign policy. Like, I think that humanitarian intervention at this point, despite what fucking Dorian Gray, Nicola Sturgeon wants, do you know what I mean? I think it is done. And that kind of, it dovetails with everything else we're talking about in terms of, the tail end of neoliberalism, like the end of this historical cycle, hopefully. But that doesn't mean that the politics of this are any less important, because imperialism is a constant permutation. The war on terror is over and is ended in unambiguous defeat. But there's a future for this trajectory. I mean, one of the things that's been a big debate in Western foreign policy circles during the Afghanistan stuff is China and Russia and how they're perceiving all this and what we do. So it was interesting in Biden's speech, he said, China and Russia are laughing at us staying in Afghanistan because they know we're not achieving anything. And that's a direct response to the hawks like Bolton, who are saying China and Russia are laughing because we're running away, right? And that both of those things are probably true, right? But, the great game in that regard is back on. I mean, literally, the great game is back on in Afghanistan, because the Taliban are in talks with Russia, China, America, everyone. Everyone wants the ear of the new government there because it's a strategically vital place. And it's just fascinating to watch the inability of the kind of Western establishment intelligentsia come to grips with the fact that now we're just one of several different houses queuing outside, queuing in the lobby of the Taliban to talk to them. Like, times change. I mean, that is a remarkable image. It's remarkable that we are now, waiting on them to speak to them. It's strange days. But like
some more strange days is one of the best takes on the situation in Afghanistan comes from Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh.
Oh God. Oh my God, man.
So Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh has a wee article out about Afghanistan.
I've not read it. I've just seen the sort of the quote the national put out.
Chose to tweet. No, I thought it was a
inflammatory. She says, what did she say? That the Taliban, they're not Boy Scouts, but they're not they're not evil either.
Like, I don't know.
Is it necessary to get into a debate about the nature of the Taliban? I really don't think it is. I mean, we'll watch and we'll see. The only thing I'd say about it, man, is that it's not worse than the people who were there before. And I know, like, people don't want to hear that, but it's true. Like, the NATO occupation was completely brutal. A thing I wanted to say when you were talking about those bombing campaigns, do you know when that ended? Days ago. The US was still bombing Afghan cities days ago, right, to try and stem the Taliban advance. So, if people have this idea that they're, I mean, it's incredible how the media has managed this, right? There's a refugee crisis now. 5.5 million people have fled Afghanistan in the last 20 years, right? And we heard a little bit about that, just a little bit about that during the refugee crisis a few years ago. But in those days, and those 5.5 million people, they're not all fleeing the Taliban by any means.
No, they're fleeing fucking American bombs.
They're fleeing American bombers. They're fleeing the permanent state of economic crisis the country's been in, right? And they're fleeing. By the way, the government in Kabul was disgusting. Like, they
totally corrupt. Like, they use the American forces in order to, like,
settle scores.
Settle scores. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, they would provide intelligence, again with the scare quotes, to US or the NATO forces in order to get back at someone.
Yeah.
And because they were completely okay with allowing a foreign power or foreign powers to direct that effort against the Taliban from day one.
Yeah, and they were still operating CIA-trained death squads right up until the very end. I mean, people were still getting assassinated and stuff right up until the very end. The level of corruption and drug dealing and killing each other, rivals and so on, was just. And the thing is, it was sort of institutionally compounded, because in the early days of the occupation, the US was handing out money to people to identify Al-Qaeda cells. So everyone just started daubing in the clan that they hated, and they were just like, the US was just going around killing random people, thinking that they were Al-Qaeda.
I mean, and like, there is a lot of truth to the fact that refugees from Afghanistan were fleeing the dire economic situation, because what happens when you start to conduct war from the sky is that you're not only killing people, but you're like destroying arable land. Like, the economic situation has been disastrous for the whole of the occupation, where you have, I can't remember the figure that you gave, but like millions of dollars being spent on conceptual fucking art projects that ain't no money for water and bread.
Yeah, and one of the consequences of the economic disruption is that Afghanistan now exports over 4 times as much heroin as it did in 2002, because, you know what I mean, like the drug lords have just consolidated all the land, and they're using it, apart from anything else, to finance the Taliban, but finance all kinds of stuff. And the thing, those drugs are coming back here. Those drugs are going back into the communities where troops in the United States and Britain were conscripted by poverty to go and fight in Afghanistan.
I'll tell you what's probably quite good for PTSD. Heroin.
A bit of Afghan heroin. So yeah, no, absolutely. Like, there's going to be all these traumatized people coming back, and no doubt ending up hooked on stuff that that is now tumbling out of Afghanistan. But that war's humanitarian, so you can't complain about all this kind of stuff. Anyway, grim tidings, but Oh, Sharon Graham won the Unite election.
I mean, was there not a smoother segue?
No. Now we've discussed that, let's discuss the next item. This is Kat's post.
So, as I predicted, Sharon Graham has been elected to the new General Secretary of Unite the Union. Right-winger Coyne has come last, so it's fucking good news all round for the trade union movement. Sharon Graham's she's a very interesting woman, excellent strategist, is interested in winning. I know that there's a degree of skepticism about what she will be able to do in terms of the Labour link. But ultimately, I know Steve Turner was the official left candidate. The reality is that for a lot of Unite members, he was the Len McCluskey continuity candidate. Let's be honest, right? The Labour link left continuity candidate doesn't fucking wash in Scotland. The only candidate to say anything about that was Sharon Graham. Doesn't wash in the Republic of Ireland either. Doesn't wash in Wales, and it doesn't wash in the parts of England where there are still pockets of industry, anywhere where there's any type of car manufacturing, any of the fucking food processing plants, any of those types of areas. Like, there was always a bit of a problem with the Corbyn project as it became at the end, because these are the parts of England that all voted to fucking leave, right?
Yeah.
Right. So when that whole Brexit fudge happened with Corbyn, it's Len McCluskey who I think did the right thing and backed Corbyn to the hilt. Like, there was a disconnect at the base, and if you have someone like Coyne who isn't going away, who has a lot of money to run a campaign because of his backers in the media and outside of the trade union, then you're in a very difficult situation. And I think Sharon Graham was able to, win for the left in a way that wasn't seen as being like the point of Unite is to fund the Labour Party, even when it's run by someone like Keir Starmer. If she'll be able to do anything about the link is another thing that we'll just have to wait to see what happens. But I do think it's interesting. It's a really interesting thing. I think it's a victory for anyone who is left-wing, who thinks the Labour Party is in crisis, and, do you know what I mean, is supportive of organising drives to allow workers to experience their own collective agency. I mean, that's what you want. Like, as a trade union organiser, it was like, how do I get workers to experience unity in action? What does that feel like? Right? And it's not about where you stand on the GRA, and it's not about like what you think of Brexit. It's not about those things. It's about like unity in action, to know that your strategic advantage is that there's more of you than there are of the boss or the management team or whatever it is. And I think Sharon Graham will be able to deliver on some of those things, like the stuff around Amazon that she promises to do is quite exciting, I think.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting because obviously there's a certain ethos around how you should organise trade union activity now in charge of the country's largest union. So it's going to be a very revealing experiment. My general thing about this is, and you're closer to these issues in many ways than I am, in all ways, but like the problems that the trade union movement face in, well, the whole Western world, right? But let's just keep it to Britain. They are really profound. And I suppose for me, I'm interested in the question of, if you apply this or that organising schema to trade union work, how much of an impact can that have, right? I'm always interested in that question of how much here is the subjective push and how much of it is the weight or the inertia of objective circumstances. Because the reality of trade unionism in the UK is most workplaces don't have a union presence.
Yeah.
obviously trade union membership has shriveled massively in the last, I mean, there's been a retreat of trade unionism in Britain for about 45 years, right? Which is a huge historical fucking like black hole. But yeah, so it will be interesting to me to see how much new ideas and a new approach to organizing can reverse, even any of those problems. And the thing I think about it is, like, that's such a challenge. I think it would be wrong if in 3 or 4 years people were saying, well, let's have a look and see if she has actually, resisted the decline of trade unionism in the UK. I think it's going to take longer than that. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in the labour market right now, right? There's a lack of labour, there's increasing wages, there's a break in the stagnation of wages, which is basically unprecedented since about 1990. So it's an interesting time on that front, but I don't envy Graham her challenges. Like,
I think it's going to be challenging, right? But I think it's important for her victory to be celebrated, right? Because ultimately, where trade unionism is strong is in the public sector, right? And as we always say, like, the public sector, for as well as it is organized, cannot lay a glove on private capital. But a union like Unite can, right? Now, public sector strike action, I think, is not impossible, right? But dating back to the one-day public sector strike over austerity on the 30th of November 2011, the TUC's purpose to coordinate between unions to deliver that type of strike action lasted one day, 24 hours before there was a fucking collapse of it, because one union thought, actually, we can settle on these terms, and the whole thing collapsed. And I think that was the end of that style of trade unionism. And I think there now needs to be a different way of doing it. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how Sharon Graham approaches those trade union bodies like the TUC. Like, the TUC can't call a fucking strike, right? I know, like, one of the kind of Trotskyist refrains is like, TUC off your knees, 24-hour general strike now. Well, they fucking did it, right? It collapsed, and those pension changes happened anyway. So I think that it'll be interesting not just to see what she's able to deliver and Unite, but to see what can happen, like, across the whole movement. Like, can this actually herald some type of change within the whole trade union movement? I mean, the TUC is basically just another NGO now, isn't it? Like, there's no real, like, industrial muscle. It's not a workers' parliament or anything like that. It's just a thing that, produces reports. And it wasn't that long ago before things like the TUC conference were broadcast live on television and people tuned in. I remember my granddad watching the TUC conference.
Yeah, it's a different world.
It is a totally different world, and I now think that is exhausted itself. What will be interesting is where there is the opportunity for actual conflict with private capital. Take the example of, I think, something that's still quite tricky for people in Unite to discuss is Grangemouth and what happened at Grangemouth with INEOS, like an actual conflict between the interests of labour and the interests of capital, and how easy it was for capital interests to just say, well, we're just shutting it and walking away. Do you know what I mean? So I think it'll be really interesting to see, like, those types of conflicts unfold in real time. Like, can concessions be won? I've said a few times now that I think that the big fights for a lot of workers has to be about working time. It has to be about the length of the working day, the length of the working week. Not just about wages. But I think the pandemic has put a lot of things into perspective for people about what really matters. Do you know what I mean? Like, spending time with your family who live in a different country, or, do you know what I mean, your neighbors or your pals, like, whatever that is, like, that's actually a really important thing, and I think that people are starting to shift their perspective on that. So I think watch this space. I think I said that last week about the SNP and the Greens as well.
Oh, nicely segued, because I was just thinking there, I should have gone from Afghanistan to the SNP and Green Coalition.
Because the Greens have been they've been quite silent about the NATO stuff, haven't they? I thought they were supposed to be like a sort of big anti-NATO. But
obviously, all.
Do you think that is because of the coalition?
I think it's a bit of both. So I think it's partly that they don't want to say, they're not going to say in the middle of a negotiation with the SNP, unlike the SNP, we opposed the war in Afghanistan. Do you know what I mean? And unlike the SNP, we're opposed to NATO, which has been occupying Afghanistan for 20 years and has just faced its worst military and political defeat. Time for a rethink, SNP. They're not going to say all that in the middle of a negotiation. But it's also the humanitarianism stuff. Like the Greens are dripping in it, right? It'd be so hard for Green politicians to come out and say, look, yes, we need to talk about, helping the Afghan people in purely non-militaristic and non-meddling ways. However, we need to recognize that this complete catastrophe has been brought about by NATO and the war on terror and so forth. Very difficult for them to say that because of who their social base are. And the social base doesn't want to hear it. I mean, I did a thing where I went around and looked at what some of the kind of NGO figures in Scotland were saying, and it was just the most apolitical, nihilistic attitudes, basically. So it's very difficult for them to escape the orbit of that kind of politics and say something that's actually incisive and political. I mean, there are statistics out showing, well, first and most importantly, that the public overwhelmingly rejects humanitarian war, right? Even more so than they did at the time of the Iraq War and so on, right? Humanitarian war, what a phrase. But they overwhelmingly reject it. But it does also show that there's slightly more support for it on the left than there is on the right, right? Which is the big problem here. I mean, there's a certain sense in which right-wing politics is simply more pragmatic and less prone at times to these sorts of reactionary utopias. Do you know what I mean? This weird thing of like, we could save the people in Afghanistan if only they'd accept our lifestyles. Like that's a certain type of reactionary attitude that has a purchase on the liberal left, where it doesn't really have a purchase anywhere else. So anyway, I think it's both genuinely ideological and based on the fact that they're having these talks. Anyway, there is a coalition agreement. And it is a coalition agreement.
It is a coalition agreement. I'm fucking gaslit over this. It's a coalition.
Yeah. So the reason people are saying it's not a coalition is because there's not full cabinet collective responsibility, but it's very rare.
The same as the Tory Lib Dem coalition.
Yeah. If there's a slight difference, it's the Lib Dems had to go along with all the austerity. That was one of the agreed areas. The agreed areas in the coalition are an independence referendum that's not going to happen and a bunch of policy stuff that's not going to happen, right? So they all agree on that stuff, and then they can criticize each other in other areas. But that's quite common for coalitions to arrive at an agreement like that. And yeah, they've got a couple of ministerial positions. So like, yeah, I mean, it is the more flexible end of what a coalition is, but that's just a type of coalition. I assume, because it's in any of these situations, it's generally the case that the more powerful force going into it has gotten what it wants out of the situation broadly. There are times when coalitions hurt the bigger party. So that was true recently in Italy with where the Lega Nord, just the Lega now, was able to undercut the Five Star movement, who were actually the bigger party. But Lega were coherent and the Five Star were the most incoherent thing in the world.
So bananas.
Yeah. So I mean, they were ripe to get torn to bits by something with a sort of instinct.
I don't understand about like the Green. I mean, I think it was pretty obvious for months that the Greens were champing at the bit for the coalition.
Mhm.
But I don't, this is probably why I'm not a politician, but the Greens are literally the only competitor to the SNP, aren't they? Like, they're the only, like, they're the only pro-independence alternative that has seats. You know what I mean? They're the only established pro-independence alternative to the left of the SNP. What's in it for them?
Yeah.
Do you think that they know that they're kind of at the limit?
I wonder about that. I mean, honestly, I don't think you can entirely separate things out from the personal. Look, if you're Patrick Harvey, how long's he been leading the Greens? A good while, right?
Long time.
If
He
you
must
can,
be one of the longest serving parliamentarians. Must be.
look, if it all goes sour and the Greens lose seats in the next election, right, which I don't think is necessarily going to happen. I'm just saying, even if that were the worst outcome, right, Patrick Harvey can just say he can just move into the third sector or whatever, where he can get any job he wants, right? Once you've been a minister in the government, you have access to various things. I mean, that's putting it very cynically, right? But I'm not saying it's the whole reason it's happened, but I'm saying it's a factor in politics, in a political career. It's a factor. You know, in some senses, it might create difficulties for the Greens if they turn it down, because you might get an element of opinion in the party who are like, we're not ambitious at all. We're not even trying to win anything here. We just want to be our own little party. So there's maybe a little bit of that. But yeah, I think maybe the strategic thought is, look, we're winning among artists and academics and third sector types and kind of boho types, right? But there's an area of Scotland, kind of middle Scotland, who want to see that we're serious, that we can take ministerial posts, that we can have a degree of collective responsibility, that we can administer and not just protest, right? So maybe that's the kind of longer term strategic thought. But the SNP get so much more out of this. They close the left flank, right? My assumption, as I've said, is that there's not going to be an independence referendum, and that means that, you know, in 2025, 2026, who knows how that will have reacted on public consciousness. Once again, this hasn't happened. It's very hard to say. But what there won't be is a sort of legitimate centre-left pro-independence party, right, that a certain block of aggrieved SNP voters could then go to. They've closed that down, right? And I don't really think that sort of Green voters will go towards something like Alba or something, right? And certainly didn't in the last election. So they've closed down the kind of their left flank and their independence flank, right? Those are the two big things to get out of it. And there's some window dressing, you know, like COP26 is coming up and the Greens are in power. I mean, this is the other thing though, like the environmental issues have never been bigger and the Greens are about to compromise themselves on all the environmental issues. I don't
get it, but this is, as I say, why I'm probably not a politician.
Yeah, but I feel that Green Partyism in general is a bit of a dead end, and I think it's been proven to be as such already all over Europe. So, in a sense, I just think, well, it's got to go somewhere, right? And into the centre is, I suppose, where it generally where it goes. But you know that, I don't know, it might have an interesting impact on consciousness among some sort of people on the left in Scotland, because the Greens were a real option, and I think in a few years' time they really might not be, right? Now, see on some of the other policy matters, I think this is important. This is understood, right? So one of the things that was in there in the policy prospectus was rent controls, right? And you could say, well, if that actually happened, then the Greens could ride into the next election. The Greens can go into the next election saying, like, oh, look, we won this. This is what it's like when you get Greens in office, right? So vote for us again. But the very fact that that's going to be in 2025 implies to me that it's not going to happen, or at least that the Scottish government the SNP and the Greens don't want it to happen, right, or are prepared for it not to happen. The SNP don't want it to happen because the landlord lobby is really important to them, right? So they've put it in 2025 because this is what the SNP does. It runs down the clock on pieces of legislation that it doesn't want to enact. Something will come up that means this can't happen, and it has to go bleed over into the next parliament, and both parties will run on it with it in their manifestos, no doubt. But here's the thing: the Greens knew this as well. When they agreed to a policy programme as part of the coalition that had rent controls in 2025, the Greens knew what that meant. The Greens knew that that meant that it wasn't going to happen, right? And what they want to be able to do is, we fought for rent controls, but the SNP said no. So what we need to have next time is a government where we have more representation, this sort of thing. So the game is afoot. And my only point on this would be, because you get people saying, well, now the Greens need to avoid kind of corporate capture or capture by the state or whatever. It's been going on for years. The Greens have been passing cuts budgets for years and years and years. This coalition deal was done with, capitulation in mind, right? So it's not that this stuff is planned out in advance. And there needs to be a degree of canniness about all that, because it is going to be a major fight over the rent controls, as long as the extra parliamentary forces around it understand, and I presume they will, that neither side in this is sincere about getting it through. It's going to be movements versus government, as far as I'm concerned, and it's important that people understand that, and we don't get drawn into the bullshit, circuit of Scottish politics. And on that note of the bullshit circuit,
I mean, we are the bullshit circuit of Scottish politics. This is the bullshit circuit.
I think that was a very enlightening episode.
This podcast.
Are we done?
Yeah. I mean, it's super sunny, so I'm gonna go sit outside for about 5 minutes and then come in because I'm too hot.
Yeah, sounds good. I think I was sweating earlier. Just sitting.
Of course.
Yeah.
Like, that's the first part. That's when you realize that you're like a disgusting human being. That's just when I've been sitting at the table and like the sun is beating down on my back and I can feel like a little bead of sweat roll down my back. I'm like, fucking scum, man.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's because nobody's got air conditioning.
Yeah, we're not used to it.